These are my night terrors.
My night terrors exist.
Please consider subscribing to my channel. It had been nearly a year since Michael had visited his doctor and was told he would have to have a heart transplant if he were to have any chance at living beyond his 30s. He was 37, and besides this now terrible disease that was affecting his heart, he was in overall good physical shape. He never touched drugs or alcohol. He was active and loved sports, all of which made him a likely candidate to receive a heart if one were to become available to him, and luckily for him, that day had come. Michael was sitting at the kitchen table with his wife and 2 children when his cell phone rang. After a brief exchange with his doctor, Michael cried out loud and was overcome with emotion. His wife and kids all celebrated when he shared the outstanding news with them, as they all stood up and embraced each other in tears of joy. There was no time to spare. They hurried and left for the hospital, where Michael said goodbye to his wife and kids and was taken into another room where the doctors and nurses prepared him for the very serious surgery. It was about 9 hours later when the primary surgeon came out to speak with Michael's wife and kids. The procedure had taken longer than expected due to some unforeseen complications, but nothing that couldn't be resolved. Overall, the transplant was a great success, and after much worry and stress about everything, Michael's wife and kids were allowed to go back and see Michael, who was now just starting to wake up from his surgery. After a few minutes, Michael's wife Sarah started to stroke his cheek softly. "Hello, my love," she whispered to him. "It's over now. You have your new heart." She said this as tears began to fall down her face. Michael's eyes shot open, and he turned his head in a brisk sudden movement, staring at his wife with a look of shock and bewilderment. At that moment, his kids came to his side and started to hug their father, when his arms flailed upwards and he began to scream and push his kids away, cursing at them. Alarms started to sound on the monitors beside him. A couple of nurses rushed in and had Michael's family wait outside as they tried to stabilize his condition. His children were both very confused and crying hysterically as their mother reassured them that he was going to be okay. But she was also confused and wondered what was wrong with Michael. He had never acted this way or used such vulgar language in the almost 15 years they had been together. After almost a month in the ICU, Michael's team of doctors gave the okay for him to head home after closely monitoring him. His wife had barely left his side since he came out of surgery. The kids were still afraid of what had happened and had been staying with their aunt, Sarah's sister. Michael hadn't said a whole lot to his wife since his surgery. He was conscious and very irritable, and any little thing seemed to set him off. The doctors told Sarah to have patience and that he should slowly return to his former self, but it only became worse. A few months had passed when Sarah had just put the kids to bed and laid down next to Michael, who was already asleep. All he seemed to do was sleep. He wanted nothing to do with his rehabilitation. He was no longer the man she had married, she started to feel. She prayed every night for him to come around and be like he was, a loving and caring husband and father. That night, as she lay beside him, she began to pray, and this time out loud. As she was praying, she opened her eyes and glanced over at her husband, who was now sitting up and staring daggers at her. She gasped and she began to speak to him. "Honey, what's wrong?" He turned his head ever so slowly, looking up towards the corner of the room, and a look of dread fell upon him. Michael started to scream. He pulled the covers up over his head. Sarah reached out to console him and laid her hand on his shoulder. Michael's head tilted backwards, still underneath the blanket. A low, terrifying growling started to emit from under the blanket. Sarah retracted her hand immediately. "Honey," Sarah exclaimed loudly, "what on earth are you doing?" Sarah got up and off the bed and hurried over to the wall across from them, flicking on the overhead light. Michael suddenly stopped growling and laid back, still under the blankets, and rolled over on his side. Sarah, who was now overcome with fear and confusion, stared at him for a few minutes and decided not to go back to bed beside him, but went to make some tea in the kitchen instead. She sat at the couch sipping her tea and tried to distract herself from what had just happened while she watched some TV. Many hours later, she was awakened by Michael, who was now tapping her on the shoulder. Sarah almost screamed out loud, still completely frightened by what had happened the night before. Michael, spoken in a low voice, started to tell her how he didn't feel like his normal self. He was having constant vivid nightmares which he hardly ever had before. He explained to her some of these nightmares. It wasn't easy for him to talk about them, as they were very disturbing, but in many of these nightmares he wasn't being pursued by evil or benevolent beings. He was evil. He was the one hurting people, and in very graphic ways. When he tried to explain what he was doing, he would burst into tears and stop talking. Sarah just looked at him with a look of shock as her jaw laid open. After repeated attempts to convey his dreams and feelings to her, he became extremely frustrated and started to scream obscenities, which was way out of his normal character. Sarah looked at her husband with empathy and a yearning to help him in whatever she could do. She couldn't bear to see him in this state. She thought things were going to change for the better now that Michael's heart transplant was successful. A sudden urge came over her to reach out and embrace her husband to console him. She hated to see him in pain like this. When she did this, though, Michael seemed to snap. He pushed her off of him immediately and got up, flipping over the coffee table. As he did so, smashing it on the floor, sending shards of glass everywhere. He stood there breathing heavily with his expression completely changed, and a devilish smile came across his face as he looked directly at Sarah, who was now looking up at him from the floor. "You want to know who I've hurt in my dreams, Sarah? Would you like to know what I have done to them? What I have done to you, Sarah?" He then reached down and grabbed hold of one of the pieces of glass, gripping it tightly, as blood began to ooze from out of his clenched fist. His tone then changed and he began to scream at her. "Do you want to know what I have done to you, Sarah? What I'm going to do to you right now, Sarah?" He then lunged towards her with the broken piece of glass. Sarah quickly scrambled to her feet, running towards the front door, screaming at the top of her lungs for help. She ran to the street and into the arms of a woman walking by the house. She pleaded with this woman to help her and that her husband was trying to kill her. Michael then came crashing out of the house, falling onto the porch. Barely able to stand on his feet, Michael cast his wild gaze upon Sarah and the strange woman. At that moment, Michael began to clench his chest and fell over. After seeing this, Sarah walked over to his side. "Something's wrong," Michael kept saying over and over again. Sarah, keeping her distance, began to cry and yelled at the lady behind her to call an ambulance. With a look of confusion on her face, the woman called 911. Michael, looking on the verge of death, opened his eyes and looked at Sarah. An evil smile swept across his face as his life left his body. His heart had stopped. The doctors weren't really sure what had happened. One had suggested Michael's body had begun to reject the new heart, but nothing was conclusive. None of them could explain for sure why he had gone insane. Sarah had her suspicions that the new heart belonged to someone sadistic in nature, and Michael died trying to fight the evil that had overcome him, but who could say for sure?